Three, two, one.
Hey, so that's 7 o'clock. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Aldez's Lib Dem Leadership Election Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Josh Matthews. I'm chair at Aldez. Before I pass you on to our fantastic host for tonight, Emma, for anyone who's new to Aldez, we're the Association of Lib Dem Engineers and Scientists. So we aim to be the Lib Dems community for anybody involved in or enthusiastic about STEM. So science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. We aim to provide expertise for policymaking at all levels of the party through working groups, briefings, events, and so on. And finally, we really try and hammer home the importance of evidence-informed policy, both inside and outside of the party. So it is my pleasure to hand over to Emma Colliver from the Aldez exec, first and foremost, a PhD student in cancer immunology, to introduce our candidates and kick off the discussion. Hope you enjoy the evening, and I'll see you again towards the end.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, good evening, everyone, from a sunny Richmond Park here, and a special welcome to our two leadership candidates, Ed Davey and Layla Moran. Before we begin the main event, we'll start with a few housekeeping points. Tonight's event will last for around 80 minutes and we'll be talking all things STEM. We will be taking opening and closing statements from each candidate, and in between we'll be posing questions on 6 major topics. So these are digital and data, STEM education, the UK R&D landscape, the green agenda, health and social care, and STEM in the party. So plenty for the candidates to get stuck into there. Thanks to those members who have already submitted questions for tonight's event, but don't worry if you haven't already, as throughout proceedings, you can still share your thoughts and submit supplementary questions. If you're watching the live stream page on the party's website and want to participate, then simply click "Want to join the conversation," watch on YouTube to enable chat. Alternatively, you can tweet using our hashtag #AldezQ&A. And of course, we'd remind you to please be respectful in your communications. Finally, a British Sign Language version of tonight's event is also available at the Zoom link. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the BSL interpreters, Claire and Jonathan, who are joining us today. Right, so on to the main event now. First, we'll be hearing opening statements of up to 3 minutes from each candidate. And kicking off tonight's proceedings, we have Ed Davey.
Thanks, Emma. And it's great to be with Aldez. I think you'll know these are very challenging times, challenging for our party, challenging for the country. We're going to have an extremely bad recession, whether it's the worst in 100 years or 300 years, we'll find out, but it's extremely deep. And that will be the most challenging issue facing politics over the next few years. And of course, we've still not sorted out COVID by any means. And then we've got Brexit, we've got the climate emergency. We're going to need a lot of scientists and engineers to help us get out of this. And we need you to help advise the party. As leader, I think I'd bring both vision and experience to show how liberal ideas are the best for tackling these challenges that we face. Take the economy and climate. I think too often they've been separated. I've argued they need to come together, and my Green Economy Recovery Plan does just that. And it uses a lot of science and engineering behind it, whether it's on green homes, refurbishment, whether it's on green transport and R&D, whether it's on green power, and indeed rewilding nature, the jobs that can come in the nature side of the green debate. And I think we can be proud as a party of our record. You know, I fought the Tories on climate and won, and we nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power. We're now the world leader in offshore wind. You know, how many times can we say that we've taken science, applied it with economics, and become a world leader? And we should be proud that we did that. And of course, there's many areas we can do that. And, you know, it's not just a greener economy that I want to stand for. I want to stand for a fairer society. And whether it's the time when I worked for Paddy Ashdown as his economics advisor, developing the policy of a penny income tax for education so we can invest in our education system more, or when it's work I did with Paddy on the basic income. And I've always argued for progressive policies. And one of the things I'm arguing for in this leadership election is that we should focus more on caring. You know, there are 10 million carers in our country, 3 times as many people who voted for us at the last election. You know, post-COVID, why can't we be the voice of carers? I've got quite a history in caring throughout my life. I had to care for my mother. My dad died when I was 4, then my mother became terminally ill when I was 12, and I nursed her with my brother till she died. Now I look after my disabled son, John, with my wife. He needs 24/7 care. So I've got a lot of lifetime experience of the practical realities. And I think that gives me ability to connect with voters who have that and share that experience and help them think about their challenges. And, you know, when we come to the party's got massive challenges. We had the general election review. It showed there was no quick fix. And the sharpest criticism was, you know, people don't know what we stand for. And that's going to be the core job of the leader and the party going forward. And I think my vision of a greener, fairer, more caring country can help connect that. You know, friends, I think we can win again. We've got some fantastic members, some fantastic people like yourselves who can really help us get things right. I get quality media cut through, like the huge media coverage I got when I got the Prime Minister to commit to an independent inquiry into COVID. I'm an experienced campaigner. I'm the only MP in our party's history to have won a seat of general election without being targeted. So I think I bring all the skills and experience to this job, but I want to build the team working with you and many others across the party so we can win again. I know we can. So please back me for the leadership.
Thank you, Ed. And now to Layla.
Well, thank you, Emma, and thanks you all for coming. And actually, one of my inspirations for studying physics at university were the lectures of Richard Feynman, who famously said, "I am smart enough to know that I am dumb." And his appetite for knowledge was driven by an insatiable curiosity, and he was known for his ability to explain complex problems in a way that anyone could understand. In an age where everyone strives for absolute certainty, I try and challenge my own assumptions by seeking opposing views, and I'm not afraid to try new approaches and embrace change. And that art of taking a complex problem, explaining it, and genuinely engaging people in solving it is as valuable to politics as it is to science. Since entering Parliament, I've stood up for our scientific community at every opportunity, whether that's using the first ever words I spoke as an MP to ask a question about Euratom, fighting for more investment in research and development, challenging the government's arbitrary visa rules that shut out thousands of talented scientists, engineers and medics, or making the case for cooperation with our European partners on research after Brexit. And as chair of the cross-party inquiry into coronavirus, I'm working to ensure that the voices of science and medical experts are heard so that the mistakes that we've seen are never repeated. As leader, I want us to be a party of science and technology, because this goes hand in hand with our liberal values, and it's integral to my campaign priorities of education, the environment, and the economy. But also because I find it fun. Supporting high-tech and scientific industries isn't only important for constituencies like Oxford West and Abingdon, they're essential to building a stronger economy that benefits the whole country and indeed the planet. As a former physics and maths teacher, I passionately believe that we should be improving access to STEM subjects, both in schools and as part of a bold programme for lifelong learning. And we need to be at the forefront of fighting for our planet's future with an ambitious science-led approach, investing in green technology to tackle the climate emergency. But we can't achieve any of this if we continue, as we have over the last decade, losing supports and seats at all levels. And we're currently at 6-7% in the polls. We are in a sink or swim situation. We need a leader who can win back support and credibly communicate our progressive vision. And we can make the case for a politics that is rational and rooted in evidence rather than the ill-informed divisive politics that seems to pervade political debate at the moment. The momentum is with my campaign to move our party and our country forward. So please, if you like what you hear in these hustings, then vote for me to be the next leader. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you there. That's fantastic. So now to our first topic, digital and data. And let's start big picture here. Throughout history, science and industry have been through revolutions. And it has been said that we're now entering a fourth industrial revolution, one which is bringing together advances in AI, in robotics and genetic engineering, to name just a few. Some would also say that no political party nationally has grasped the narrative around digital and emerging technologies, neither in terms of championing its benefits, nor in having answers to governance questions. So starting with you, Layla, how would you make the Lib Dems that party?
Well, first of all, we need to fully understand where we are with this. And it's really difficult because it's changing, of course, all the time. And to an extent, we have done quite a lot already. Tim Clement-Jones chaired a committee in the House of Lords about artificial intelligence. But you're right to point out that actually there is no one political party that has grasped this and also grappled with the really complex issues that it's going to release in particular. I mean, if we look back over previous industrial revolutions of this type, actually very often that wealth can be concentrated with the rich, and it leaves those who are in the bottom 20% without that redistribution. And actually that's where we need to start. We need to make sure that technology isn't concentrated, and the power that it gives, particularly in terms of the data that it collects from people, isn't concentrated with a few people, but that actually it's a democratized digitalization of our society. And I don't think that we should necessarily be trying to stop it. You know, we are a liberal party. We believe in change. We believe in progress. We should be embracing it with both hands. But we also recognize that that digital divide exists, and that those big digital companies are not acting in the best interests of the individual. And that's what we should be focusing on. So I've been pushing for a long time, and I was really pleased that we included this in our last manifesto, but I really, under my leadership, want us to be leading the way on this, which is to introduce a digital bill of rights, where we can have that national debate, and it would cover all sorts of areas. It would cover the limits of use on personal data, freedom of speech, surveillance, encryption, digital literacy. All of these things can be encompassed in this. But we haven't had that conversation as a nation. We should be learning from other countries as well. I would point people to Estonia, that has done a brilliant job at engaging its communities and its individuals in the protection of their own digital rights. And what better way of describing to people what we are for as a party, a liberal party that stands up for people's own right to have access to their own data and have control over their own lives, both their real lives and their digital lives.
Thank you, Layla. And Ed, to you now. How do we grasp this opportunity as the Lib Dems?
Well, whatever the issue is, I think one always has to bring liberal values to the problem and think about the voters as you think about that problem. So liberal values that come to mind in the digital space are freedom, our equality, and our internationalism. And applying that, we need to think about what the voters are concerned about with digital. They're concerned about their privacy. They're concerned about access. You know, they're going to get a fair crack of the whip. And they are concerned about security. So the party that's going to grapple with that has to bring a valued approach to those voters' concerns. And let me give you examples how I think we should do it. Just take COVID, you know, the problem of the moment. You know, when the government was talking about the app to, you know, to track and trace, the big issue was freedom. And people said, look, we're not going to use this app because you're going to take our data. Now, Daisy Cooper, who I'm delighted is supporting this campaign, was brilliant on that, really leading the way on the privacy issue. And I think, I mean, we may not got the hearing that we deserved on it, but we've come across as a party protecting the freedom of the individual. And it goes back to the things we've done, you know, in coalition before on the Snoopers Charter, where we stopped privacy being challenged. So, you know, freedom, you can apply that value to voters' concerns on privacy, and I think we win every time, particularly in the digital age. I think equality, it means a lot to people. and COVID, they've seen how kids haven't been able to access education because they haven't had a laptop at home, they haven't had access to Wi-Fi. And I'm really proud of what Kirsty Williams did as the Welsh Education Minister. She, unlike Gavin Williamson, managed to overcome that problem, brought liberal ideas and liberal leadership to making sure that there was a much more fair outcome in Wales than in England for kids, for access. And you can apply that to the whole industry. As Layla was saying, there's a real danger in industries that can be highly concentrated. The FANGs of this world, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Googles, and the Netflix, and so on, where a lot of money, a lot of power can go into one person's hands, and we need to make sure that doesn't result in inequality in terms of income and wealth, but also inequality in terms of power. We've got to stand up for that with our commitment to equality. And then it comes to security. I mean, we don't often talk about this.
If I could interrupt, Ed, I mean, perhaps I can build on that then and ask you, we know this data is being collected at the moment at a sort of unprecedented pace. You've mentioned the COVID-19 tracking app, and that's, of course, raised these important questions about privacy. So how do we ensure that those big companies, for example, those collecting data, are doing so legally and ethically? What role should government be playing in that? And I wonder as well if you might comment specifically on GDPR in this context as well.
Well, a lot there, Emma. I mean, I think people don't really trust the government. So I think you have to have an independent regulator in this. And linking that to GDPR, I think the ICO has established themselves and are gaining people's trust in governing the GDPR. I mean, the problem is they're underfunded, right? And the only problem with an independent regulator is they depend on the government giving them cash or the industry giving them cash, and there's those problems. So you need to make sure those independent regulators that are going to police this are going to be able to do it and have the tools to do it. And that sort of links, Emma, to what I was going to go on to say about security, because it does link to these very large, mainly American big tech companies and their impact on us. Because actually, it's one of the many reasons why Brexit is a disaster. Brexit is a disaster because the European Union, through competition, did take on Microsoft, did take on Google in a way that individual countries feel unable to. And I think we need to work with other countries to take on these big multinationals. And that's one of the reasons why I was so committed to the European Union, because it gave us the ability to take on this international capital when it abuses its power, whether it's in tech or wherever it is. And the other issue which I was coming to is security. And the reason I mention security is the other side, the right wing, the national populists, the Tories, use security as an issue as a reason for undermining people's privacy. They're always wrong. But they're even more wrong when it comes to Brexit. Because we're coming out of the European Union, we're going to lose access to critical databases like the European Criminal Records Information System, like Schengen II. These are databases which our police and security services interrogate many, many times every day to tackle the worst villains in our world. We're going to lose access to Europol. And so Brexit, because it undermines international cooperation, which we need in the digital space more than ever, is going to undermine our ability. And we need to make that point very clear. Well, obviously, we have done. But as we go forward, even when we've left the European Union, we need to talk about European cooperation, international cooperation on security grounds and push that back. Because I think the Tories are really weak.
Now I think perhaps if we could, and perhaps Layla, if you might want to say a few words, on this issue of data again, of these big companies, any of this.
Absolutely. So, I mean, firstly on GDPR, I know that there are many Lib Dems who sort of go, oh, it's the bane of our lives, but actually, by and large, it's a really fascinating and interesting and important piece of legislation that was created as an EU initiative. We did this with other countries, and it's still relatively new. It's being used as an excuse sometimes for data not being shared where it probably should. So a good example being in this coronavirus crisis, there was the excuse given by government that local public health bodies couldn't get access to their testing data because of GDPR. And actually, my understanding is that that's a very grey area, and actually one that I understand there is a way that should have been able to happen. So clearly it needs developing over time. The ICO does clearly need more money, and they just can't get through the cases, because the problem we have is that when there is misuse of data, it needs to be dealt with quickly. It can't be something that is left to language. And at the moment, there are cases with the ICO that are taking years. They just don't have the resourcing. But to these big tech companies, actually, interestingly, they themselves say they want stronger regulation. It'll be interesting to see to what extent they mean that. And I think that actually, as a country, we should be looking again across at our neighbours at the European Union who are pulling together legislation on this right now. This is a really important place for cross-European and also international cooperation. In fact, the Americans are looking at this too. Congress, some of you might have seen, are holding hearings themselves with the heads of the big tech giants. And at its core, I think needs to be transparency. I mean, GDPR was meant to do that to an extent, and freedom of information, again, was meant to be able to do that to an extent. But the best disinfectant, in my view, is always sunlight. It's always transparency. And at the moment, the power lies with the companies. The power does not lie with the individual. And that's the debate that we need to have as a country. Where do we want that power to sit? And to what extent are we willing to give up, let's say, free Gmail, if it then meant that we would have more control over our own data? And actually, this debate is very, very live, and one that I think our party should be leading on.
Absolutely, I think so too. And just to sort of round off this section, which obviously has, you know, a whole host of topics involved in it, scientific advance, you've both mentioned, is an international endeavour, very much an international cooperative effort. But with this, questions are arising as to the suitability of international vendors in providing our national infrastructure. And specifically, just briefly from both of you, I wondered if we could just have your comments on the rejection of Huawei from the UK telecoms infrastructure, and how you might look to manage similar appointments. So Leila first there.
Yeah, so this has been a complete mess from the side of the Conservative Party, who at one point said that they thought it was fine so long as it was only a stripped back version. And then we keep discovering the way that China is clamping down on human rights, clamping down on people's freedoms, and particularly the developments in Hong Kong, and the way that they are flagrantly flouting international law there, has made everyone think again. And actually, I think it's the right move. The problem I have is that they've done it for the wrong reasons. So what I described was, I think, the right reasons. I think we do need to stand up to China. It does need to be something that is done as best we can European-wide, and actually our influence not being there in the European Union is missed, because there are still lots of debate going around this in European countries. But the reason why ultimately they did it, the Tories, was because they want to cozy up to Trump, and because they want a deal, a quick and dirty deal with between Donald Trump, managed by Liz Truss, Lord help us, in order to open up the markets here so that they can make up for some of the mess that they've created with Brexit. That's the wrong reason to do this, but broadly I've supported it.
And Ed?
Yeah, the party supported it, and let's be clear, there are two different theories about why we need to reject Huawei. There's a Liberal Democrat human rights approach, for the way Huawei is so linked into the Chinese Communist Party, is linked into the oppression of the Uyghurs in Western China, where they're the people behind all the cameras and all the IT of the concentration camps. And I think Liberal Democrats therefore are right to sort of put our opposition to Huawei because of that link. There's the Tory approach, which Leila touched on, which I think goes actually even deeper than the trade deal, because I think there's something that we need to think about in the party, and how it's going to impact on trade and security policy and everything. And that is the battle between China and the United States. This is the big geopolitical issue of our generation. The United States has been the unqualified superpower for decades now, and China is going to become the superpower. I mean, it's going to happen. And the real worry is, in history, when one superpower replaces another, more often than not, that's resulted in war and conflict. And I'm not predicting war, but we know there are people, the hawks, the Republican hawks in Washington, who are thinking about that. So how we play on this space is going to be critical to how our world is over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And Huawei is a tiny, tiny part of that. But when we as a party think about it, we've got to think about human rights, we've got to think about the economy. We've also got to think about global security and how we manage that.
Thank you. So, right, we're going to move away from digital and data now and on to our second topic, which is STEM education. So we've obviously talked a lot about all these new technologies and new science, if you like, and science is changing at a rapid pace. So how do we ensure that STEM education continues to be up to date and inspiring for students today? So Ed, we'll start with you here.
Well, this isn't my specialist subject. I'm on the humanities and I'm an economist. However, it's absolutely critical to our country, and at all levels, primary, secondary, tertiary, we need to find ways to encourage kids to be STEM involved and STEM literate, and to, even if they don't specialize in it, to be aware of it. And hopefully by more youngsters and young people and students going into STEM subjects, that the STEM side of our economy and our society will flourish. And there are many theories about how you do it. One is that you focus on girls, actually, because the reality is fewer girls have gone into STEM. Now, the numbers have changed in recent years, but I think there's more to do on that. Another issue is about the divide between vocational and academic, that there are some youngsters who actually would quite respond to many aspects of STEM, but they're not as academic as others. And maybe there's a vocational route into STEM that we should be looking at developing further. And I also think that, when you look at vocational academic, the need to, and I think the desire to enable youngsters to have more choice about what's their curriculum, how they put that together, is another key part of how we develop STEM. I mean, this is showing my age, but I remember a report under Labour called the Tomlinson Report, going back about 15, 16 years, which really tried to end the vocational and academic divide. And one of the reasons was in order to strengthen the number of people taking STEM subjects. And, I think we need to think quite radically, far more radically than we've been doing in that sort of space. I think finally...
So if I could briefly interrupt and pass over to Layla now, because we're obviously very short of time this evening. Layla, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I hope I can be brief because this is very much my pet subject. So I was a maths and physics teacher for the best part of 13 years before I became a parliamentarian. And there's a few things here. I mean, the point about being up to date, I think, is really well made. There were a lot of my colleagues, when I was fresh out of Imperial, started teaching, who actually hadn't had some of the updates in a long time. And that's why high quality professional development is a critical part of improving this, because actually, I mean, science is exciting. It's changing all the time. I remember by the time I finished teaching, there were things that I was now teaching that hadn't even been really discovered when I'd left my degree. And then I was looking across at some of my colleagues who had left their own degrees 30 years ago. And yes, you'd keep up, but actually it needs to be much more systematic than that. And one of the things that I've been working on is when we give more power to teachers, and I'll come to this in a moment because I think that's actually the answer, you also have to have a quid pro quo there. And I think most parents and most businesses, in fact, would trust teachers to devise a curriculum that is inspiring, that is up to date, if they knew that, just like doctors, for example, they had regular recertifications. So they were absolutely up to date, not just with their own subject, but also teaching itself. Just brain development in adolescence has improved so much in the last 10 years. They have to keep up to date with that. But at its core, I think, are two things. One is that we have an education system that under Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings, frankly, went backwards in its approach to learning, where children's heads are vessels to be filled with knowledge. And what better way of doing that? Maths and science, everyone just thinks there's a right answer. Everything is a straight line. My goodness, how much better would coronavirus and the response to coronavirus have been if we had taught more about exponential growth at a young age, for example? We have to get children to ask, not just have the content knowledge, but to learn how to ask the best questions. That is the way that you inspire them, because at that point they then start to answer their own questions. They are coming up with what it is that they want to answer, and very often the answers to those questions are even more complex than some of the basic content that we are teaching as part of the curriculum now. But the second part to it is creativity, is recognizing that actually science itself is creative. And it's not just a case of a right or wrong answer. There are shades of grey. There are ways to engage them. And actually science has a place in wider discourse. I used to teach, for example, the International Baccalaureate. And one of the units that we would teach was about the green science. I would teach the science of wind turbines. We would talk about nuclear energy. And through doing it, through something that they were really passionate about, that's how they were inspired. So let's give teachers a bit more autonomy. Let's make sure they're up to date, but also let's turn it on its head. Questions, not just answers.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to stick with you now, Layla, Vince Cable obviously famously championed the proposal for a lifelong skills wallet. So how would both the candidates build on this proposal or support this proposal to help people looking to update their skill set in this ever-changing world? So sticking with you first, Layla.
Thank you. Well, yes, all credit to Vince. What he did was he set up a commission that looked at this, and it was party members and also FE colleges were represented and academics, and they came up with this idea. And then I brought it to conference, and actually I really loved it at the last election. I wish we had pushed it more, because if you now fast forward to where we are now, coronavirus has meant, it's a 1 in 300 year economic event. It is going to mean huge fluxes in our economy. And the ability to be able to be flexible to that, offering lifelong learning, not just to those who are recently left their degrees or their apprenticeships, but also to those who are mid-career, who are one of the groups that I think are not being thought about enough right now. Lifelong learning accounts are definitely part of the answer. And what they do is they allow individuals to make decisions for themselves about how they want to improve, whether it's a change of career. You could also top up lifelong learning accounts on a sector by sector basis, which is, I think, a development that we need to be looking into. But what it also does is it increases not just demand, but also supply. Because if there was a ecosystem of lifelong learning, much of it was decimated. We know that the Open University has done particularly poorly in the last few years, and that's because of a lack of support from government. Lifelong learning accounts is a really interesting way to increase the amount of money that people themselves are putting into their own education over time, and also support FE colleges, and other ways of delivering tertiary education.
Thank you, Layla. And Ed, your thoughts on retraining or sort of learning through life, as it were?
Well, I mean, one of the things about these hustings is, surprising enough, Layla and I agree with the Liberal Democrat policy. So I can just say I agree with my honourable friend. But let me go a little bit further to make it more interesting. I think the bit that's missing from our policy at the moment is something that speaks to equality and social justice. Because what we haven't yet got in there is enough for people who've missed out. It's particularly close to my heart because there's a college near me called Hillcroft College, which is a very unusual college. It has residential places for women. It's a women's only college, though it's now linked to Richmond College. It's a bit more complicated, but it traditionally has been a women's only college where women who've missed out on education for whatever reason can get a second chance. And I think I want to make sure our lifelong learning manages to do that as well, and make sure that it's not just a mechanism that is used by people who are already doing pretty well. We need to make sure that people who haven't done so well in early years, for whatever reason, get that chance. And we need to make sure there is that extra support for them in the way that we develop the pupil premium for school kids, which is so important for disadvantaged kids. I just want to make sure there's some equity as we take that lifelong learning approach.
Thank you, Ed. And so, you know, I think we're rounding off our education topic now. We're going to move on to the third of our 6 topics before we've reached sort of the halfway mark in proceedings. So this is the UK R&D landscape. So you've actually just mentioned, Ed, I know a bit about diversity and equity of opportunity in STEM. We can also think about geographical diversity across the UK. And at the moment, figures show that 52% of R&D investment across the UK is spent in London, the southeast and the east of England, despite only 37% of the population being there in the UK. So to steal a phrase, and I'll start with you, Ed, how can we level up R&D across the UK so that we are making the most of talent across the regions?
Really interesting question. I would just say that one's got to look at what really works in R&D, and my understanding from economic analysis of R&D that I've read over the years is the importance of clusters. And if we're going to spread R&D and make it effective and value for money and being effective in the outcome for science, engineering and our society, we've got to build clusters outside London, the southeast, and the east of England. Otherwise, you know, all the universities in London, in Oxford and Cambridge are going to suck in all that inevitably. So to level up, I think we've got to think in those terms. So, you know, whether it's built around Manchester, which of course has got some fantastic universities already, linking that to that region and sub-region, whether it's trying to build something around Leeds or Newcastle or Glasgow, Birmingham, you know, one's got to look at those institutions that are actually, particularly where they're well embedded with the local industry, to see if we can make something special happen there. And you know what Vince did when he was Secretary of State for business, industry and skills was he really went for the catapults. And I saw that in energy, how we've managed to really get some good R&D in energy because of these catapult centers. And you know, he looked at what was happening in Germany, and I think that's a pretty good model. And he made sure they were in the regions, and that was begun this process. But the reality is you've got to keep on and on at it. So you know, I think there is a place for us to argue as Liberal Democrats to level up, but we can't leave it to, you know, the market or anything like that. We've got to sort of have some serious plans and decide that this is an area where this could happen, because there's already a good base there, and how can we develop that further? But it will have to be a conscious one, and there'll be opposition to it, because there'll be, you know, people in the Imperials and Oxford and Cambridge's world which will try and prevent that. But I agree. I think the overall analysis is very important, because if we're going to level up our economy, and the disparity in economic growth and economic prosperity between our regions is a stain on our country, far worse in the UK than it is in many other competitor countries. And so the only way we're going to turn it around is by looking at every single component of economic growth, whether it's education, whether it's transport, whether it's R&D. You know, I think it's possible to do, and we need to be very ambitious in how we apply this type of thinking of clusters.
Thank you, Ed. And Layla, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to take umbrage with something that Ed's just said, because I don't think it's the case that Oxford would prevent it, but it is the case that Oxford's really good at it.
Of course they pretend it.
No, and that's not what I'm hearing here, actually. And I'll tell you why, Ed. I'll tell you why. But actually, let's just explore why we're good at it. So the reason why this area is very good at it is because actually what it does is there is a very close partnership between the universities, which incidentally includes Brookes, and also businesses, and in particular, spin-out businesses. So if you've got universities that are around the country that are being asked by government, given funds by government, and supporting our universities right now, as an aside, is a really important issue. It's one that I'm very live to, very focused on in my role as education spokesperson. But they are very often the key to that link in with the community. And so if we are going to do these, much more regionalized economic plans that, yes, were started under Vince Cable and Coalition, the Tories actually haven't really understood this. So that much more devolved approach to this is absolutely right, but it has to be a partnership in those areas. But the reason why actually there is appetite for this, even in Oxford, is because bluntly, those spin out companies, when they spin out, very often can't afford to stay anyway. What they find is that they then need more lab space, more floor space. They go beyond the first 20 employees. They might be doing incredible work, but they find that if they went elsewhere in the country, there just isn't the hubs. And that's why you need to create the hubs in places like Newcastle and Leicester and others. But they can't stay here either. And what happens is many of them then end up leaving the country full stop, because there are other countries that have done this better. So it is in our country's interests as a whole to ensure that this rebalancing happens. And actually, I would argue that Oxford would welcome it.
And our final question now of this half of proceedings. Again, we've mentioned that science is often international, and it wouldn't be a Lib Dem Q&A without my mentioning the B word. How, Layla, can we stay a part of EU research and development after Brexit?
Well, I mean, they haven't made it easy. And we are all aware, I'm sure those of us who are watching this today, of the effect of Horizon 2020 funding, how important that was. And by the way, it wasn't just the money. I am in such frustration with this government because they keep talking about how if we can just replace the research funding money, then that's going to solve the problem. It was never just about the money. It was always about people and about being able to attract people to the country, but then also have that ecosystem of researchers across Europe who were able to interact easily with each other, go from one university to another, be part of a research project, and then be able to passport that around. They are now looking at are there bilateral agreements that they can make? They're going to try and recreate this piecemeal, and it's going to be much more difficult, but we have to try. And the reason why we have to try is because actually this is a huge asset. Innovation and research in this country is a huge asset to this country. And I'm very concerned with the approach that UKRI are taking to this. It's very centralizing. It's all about taking money and making sure that it's part of specific projects rather than allowing the innovation bit. Because the thing about the innovation bit is that there are several steps to innovation. And very often they focus on, what are the measurables from it? How much money will you then, if we give you this money, create for the economy? Actually, what we need is far more funding that is focused on that very first step. Let's get the right brains in the room. Let's attract the best people. Let's put them together. Let's create projects that actually may well fail and may well not work. But that's how you create innovation. And it's a deep frustration of mine that this government just does not seem to get it at all. And it's one of the things that I keep pushing in Parliament. I think we suffer from...
Layla, if I can just bring your comments to close and ask perhaps for Ed to chip in about Brexit, of course.
Well, Brexit is a disaster for a lot of the investment in science and R&D. That's one of the reasons why you saw so many scientists and people in universities leading campaigns against Brexit. And one of the real sad things is when you looked at the European budgets and where actually the UK did well, science and innovation, R&D was where we actually topped the league. Because we have such great universities here, we would suck in a lot of the money. And so, while Leila's right, it's not just about money. There's going to be a gap there, a huge gap there. And we've got to fill that. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble. Now, if you look at where the UK has comparative advantage, again, I'm coming from an economist point of view. And if you look at different industries, one of the industries actually we are one of the world leaders is HE, and therefore this is bad news. But I want to underline the point about people, because the restrictions on movement, but also the messages, that the underlying lack of collegiality that will be there, and the push that will be there from the EU's institutions, from national governments, that will undermine that collaboration. Of course, we'll be there at different stages, but we won't be leading it. We won't be integral to it. We'll be add-ons, we'll be afterthoughts, and that's not where we should be. So I think it's going to be tricky.
Thank you both. Right, so everyone, we're now halfway through this evening's proceedings, and I just wanted to remind those of you watching from home that you can still submit supplementary questions using the YouTube chat function or by tweeting us at #AldesQ&A. So right, on to the second half now, and on to perhaps the biggest topic of all, the green agenda. So both of you have made this a key part of your campaigns, and it is of course a topic of particular interest for many ALDES members as engineers and scientists. Some of you tuning in will have already watched the green agenda hustings, so in the interests of time we won't repeat all those questions again, but we have two specific questions that we'd like to ask you this evening. So Ed, I'll start with you. The goal of many international governments, of course, is now to decarbonise and green up society. Science will play a part, as will personal actions. But specifically, how do we incentivise and support businesses in making this transition?
Well, I've thought about this long and hard, and the best way to do it is to change the economic system. Because then you go to the heart of all decision making. All the different agencies, investors will therefore have to take charge of climate change, and that will see money switch away from the dirty old economy to the clean new economy. What does that mean? I mean, I've talked in the past about decarbonizing capitalism. What that means is you change the rules. You change the rules that apply to the stock exchange, to the banks, to the pension funds, to the debt markets, to the insurance industries. And you require them to take account of climate change risk. This can be done. We regulate these sectors all the time. I now chair a group in Parliament, all-party parliamentary group on sustainable finance, which is pushing at this agenda. I've been to see the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who's one of the leading international thinkers on this area. And what's really interesting is there are people like him in central banks, people in the city, who absolutely agree with his agenda. And the people who are in the way are people like the Tories. And this is where I think we can be really, really radical as a party, where we can lead the debate. I think talking about completely changing how our city works is pretty radical. I also think it's not just, the reason why it's so interesting is it's not just about the UK. If you look at, for example, where the coal industry gets its finance, 15% of global coal investment is financed in the City of London. If we change the rules, we don't just affect economic activity investment in the UK, we affect it around the world. And if we became the global leader on climate finance, we could set the gold standard. So if you're looking for one area where we incentivize business, where we make a really big leap forward, it's fundamentally changing the decision process of every single investment decision. And we can do that by law.
Thank you, Ed. And Leila, your thoughts on this?
The overarching approach that needs to be weaved into all parts of government is actually at the heart of when I talk about the economy. And when I say putting well-being at the heart of the economy, that's what I mean. It comes from some of the works, Kate Raworth, for example, where we stop thinking about the planet as a finite resource, start thinking about it as the other way around, as an infinite resource, and we start thinking about it as a finite resource. And actually, if you look at where studies have happened for how we should recover from coronavirus, actually a green recovery is not just the right thing to do by the planet, it's also the best way of recovering out of this crisis. So making sure that there's huge government investment, and it is the right time now when the economy is in a slump for government to be spending huge amounts of money on this. Insulating homes, they mention the Smith School in Oxford, research and innovation, ensuring that actually there is money there for some of the big leaps forward that we need to see in terms of the technologies, some of which are at various stages of development. But if we are going to get to net zero, we are not going to do it by just reducing emissions. We are also going to have technologies that take carbon out as well. And that's going to require research and innovation. The other thing that we need to actually push back on, and I'll push back on the question ever so slightly, is that yes, personal responsibility is a part of it, but I think oil companies and others who don't want to actually do this make too much of it. There is a lot of personal responsibility that people can take. It's why education is also up there as in the top 5 things that we need to do. And people want more informed choices. We're going to get them to have a diet that is has less of a carbon footprint. We need to get them to eat less red meat, for example. But it can't just be the individual. There is a huge part to play for government as well.
And sticking with you, Layla, and sort of building on what you've just said, how do you think the dialogue needs to move forward with the fossil fuel companies themselves? You know, is there an opportunity there to help them transition as well?
Well, interestingly, I mean, if you talk to them, and very occasionally I come across them, most recently I was in Trinidad actually helping other parliamentarians learn how to do public accounts. It was all very, very interesting. But there, Trinidad and their economy is based on fossil fuels and indeed BP. And what they recognize is that their own businesses are not going to survive this. We have seen oil prices slump. They know that this is coming. And they were making a big thing about how they are investing in renewables and how they themselves are making that transition. However, they need to be forced to. And one of the ways, the big buyers of fossil fuels and the propping up of the fossil fuel markets are pension funds. So actually building it into legislation that pension funds in particular need to take into account the effect that their fund is going to have on the planet in the medium and the long term, which incidentally is the right thing to do, because on risk registers, the collapse of the fossil fuel industry is high up there. It's going to lead to big volatility. It's just coming, and it's coming ever faster now. Getting pension funds to divest early would encourage, I think, those companies to do it faster. But if I can have just one final point, there are parts of the UK, I'm thinking in particular of Aberdeenshire, that are reliant on those fossil fuels. And we also need just transition funds so that those economies, those local economies that are reliant on fossil fuels, aren't then just left behind in the same way that Thatcher did with the mining communities in the 80s. We have to ensure that those communities are well served with extra resources put in to them so that they can make those transitions as well.
And Ed, your comments on how we move the dialogue forward with the fossil fuel companies, with the BPs of this world?
Well, the theory of change says you either have to work with the incumbents or you have to beat them. Now, it's a lot easier if you can work with them, because the battle can be much tougher if they're opposed. And what's interesting is you look around the world, there are energy companies that are changing willingly. They've smelt the coffee and they're changing. So GDF Suez is now Engie, and I actually worked with them when I was outside Parliament. They really have moved dramatically and really embraced the climate agenda. I'd also point to Dong in Denmark, who were an oil and gas company, and they've now completely gone to renewables, and they're a big player in the UK offshore wind industry, and they've renamed themselves Ørsted. So you do see some fossil fuel companies changing. The others, I have to say, you know, the Mobil Exxons, the Shells, the BPs have been very slow, very slow. They've greenwashed. And I think even now they're greenwashing. And so we've got to put a lot of pressure on them. Yes, through investors, through the stock exchange, through the pension funds and so on, and through regulation that Parliament pass in the way I was talking about before with decarbonising capitalism. Because the reality is, there's something called the carbon bubble. That is that there's too much fossil fuels already discovered that if we use it all, we blow the world's carbon budget several times over. And that means that there's a real danger that stock markets will collapse when that carbon bubble bursts, and our pensions and our economies will have yet another massive recession. So the real skill is, how do we deflate that carbon bubble over the next decade or two and force and push the BP Shells and Mobil Exxons out of fossil fuels. And there are ways, you know, Layla quite rightly raised Aberdeen. What I was doing when I was Cabinet Minister for Energy and Climate Change was looking at carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and usage, which would enable some of those fossil fuels to be burnt in power stations or in heavy industry, but burnt safely for the environment because you capture the emissions and store them or use them safely. And it's those sorts of technologies using scientists and engineers that we need to transition both fairly for the employees and the communities, but also for our planet.
Thank you both. So we're going to move on to our penultimate set of questions now, and onto a topic close to many people's hearts, generally, you know, in the Lib Dems and generally, and particularly now during the coronavirus pandemic, of course. So this is health and social care. So perhaps one of the biggest criticisms of the government response to the coronavirus crisis has come in the way it was managed in care homes and in social care settings. So Ed, I'd like to start with you. I know this is a topic close to your heart as well. Social care, it's a huge issue, but what are going to be your first steps in better equipping our social care sector going forwards?
Well, let's start first of all with party policy, because party policy is pretty good on this. You know, we've argued for a penny on income tax for NHS and social care, and I costed that at the last election. We had our priorities, mental health and social care, and we do need more cash. And let's be absolutely clear, you talk to any of our local government leaders in the Liberal Democrat family who are running authorities with responsibilities for care, and they're just screaming, we just need more cash. So that's part of an answer, but it's not the only answer. I think how we integrate it with the NHS is really important. We've argued that for a long time. I think one of the ways the government failed was it said protect the NHS and forgot our care homes, and that's a disaster, a tragedy, and we should be quite cross with them about that. But how that integration happens, it can't be top down. It can't be the NHS taking over social care, as I think the Tories would do. So we need that, but we need to be careful about how it's done. We need to look at the financing. You know, the Dilnot Commission on financing of elderly care, I think was brilliant in the sense it had the principle behind it that the risk that you are one of those 1 in 6, 1 in 7 who has dementia and therefore needs 10, 15, 20 years of care, that risk needs to be pooled, just like we pool risk in the NHS. You know, our health service pools risks, social care should pool risks, and that's why it's quite a sort of radical centre-left approach that Dilnot is advocating. We need more of that. Final thing I would say on social care, though, is too often the debate is focused on care for the elderly, important though that is. Actually, social care goes very, very wide. And the caring agenda I've been talking about in this leadership election goes quite wider than elderly care. Let me give you just one example. We are seeing in our society a lot of adults who aren't able to work with physical disabilities and mental disabilities, and there's a higher number per age group than there was in the past. And if you talk to directors of social services across our country, that is the financial burning platform that they're more worried about actually than elderly care. And it's not being talked about. It's a massive issue. I feel it very strongly because, you know, I'm 54, my son is 12, he's severely disabled, and I'm going to be off this planet and he's going to live for many more years. So I worry about his care. He's going to look after him, he's going to pay for it. And that's a worry of many parents with disabled children. And actually you aggregate it up to society, it's a big issue. So we as a party, I want us to be the voice of carers, the party of caring, but we're going to have to embrace all these issues in a progressive way.
And Layla, your thoughts now.
So to the atrocious response of this government and its failure to protect our care homes, that's one of the strands that we're going to be looking at as part of the inquiry. We meet every Wednesday. We've had a couple of sessions now. One was with the BMA and the NHS Confederation. The last one was on sufferers of long COVID and bereaved families. And then actually the next one is specifically looking at social care. And some of the issues that we'll be looking at, and actually from the evidence that we've had, particularly from people like Age UK, have been absolutely heart-wrenching. They are very, very, very critical and say that because the government didn't act quick enough, they essentially criticised the government for letting people die before their time, and they were willing to put that out publicly. And I think that's where we've got to with it. The opportunity in these tragedies is that now is the moment that the government may well start to take this seriously and actually address some of the core issues that have been spoken about for a very long time. And yes, funding is a part of it, and it will not surprise anyone to hear that a penny on the pound on income tax is a great policy. I hope you all enjoy canvassing with that policy. I do. I remember knocking on someone's door in the last election talking about that policy, and their response was, oh, well, why do you want just a penny? Take two. It's the right thing to do. It's actually a tax rise that's really popular, because people can see for themselves what it's causing and the stress that it's causing them and the rest of the country, that we haven't sorted this out. The Liberal approach, though, is to have a system that is far less fragmented than it is, but also that is far more based on local authorities taking charge. And there has been, historic underfunding. We need a rethink, but we also need a public health approach to this. There's a lot of work being done on how to better have a system that prevents people from getting to that point where they need that level of care. And at the moment, if you are in dire straits and you are an elderly person, you are far more likely to start your journey into care by calling 999. It starts in acute care, and then it leads to them not being able to get places, and it's not coordinated. And one of the reasons why that bed blocking, as they call it, happens, although I think the term's unfortunate because it suggests in some way that the individual's responsible, and it's not, it's the system. One of the reasons why the system can't react as it does is because there just isn't those lines of communications. So let's bring it back into local authority control in some form, whether it's not councils themselves, but it could be a body that is far more locally based. Let's have councils be properly funded so that they can have a really well-resourced stock. The very last point I think I have to mention is staff.
I think actually, I will just quickly return to Ed on this first, give you both a chance to say a little bit more. We've actually had a question in from a member, for example, who mentions that, he has been a family carer for 10 years himself. And he's convinced, that adult social care needs to be delivered by not-for-profit providers. So I wondered, Ed, if you could comment on that at all.
Well, it's a really interesting idea. Locally in my constituency, I worked with the NHS, what was used to be called the Primary Care Trust, to spin out of it 450 employees who were in primary care, so physios, OTs, district nurses, that sort of profession. And we've created something called Your Healthcare. So Your Healthcare sits outside the NHS. It has NHS pay rates, but it's a self-managing body. It's a not-for-profit, and it's local, and it's escaped a lot of the bureaucracy. It's been very more innovative. It's delivered a lot of services. And although it's not a care home model, it's still delivering lots of domiciliary care services. And it's been a real success. And actually they do manage a dementia care home, come to think about it. So what I take from that experience is something that I've talked about a lot over the years, which is about a mutual approach. Because the way Your Healthcare organizes, it's a employee owned, not for profit. And I just think that's a very liberal model. And I mean, I'm going back a long time, but I wrote a chapter in a public service commission that we had under Charles Kennedy. And the chapter was about how we got diversity in the provision of public services. And, I'm fed up with this private public debate. There is this not-for-profit mutual organization. We call it a public benefit organization or public benefit corporation. I forget exactly the term we used. But I'd like to go back to that model, because I think these mutual organizations, which, don't have to be locally based, but I think they're better if they are, that can be employee owned, have a real role to play. And I'd like to develop that particularly in the social area, social care, health. From my experience, it can really work well.
And Layla, any last thoughts about these different models of social care and healthcare, as it were?
Yeah, so the liberal approach is actually to be, I'm personally agnostic about whether it's a body or if it's a government or if it's a company that's delivering a service. What I care about the most is that it's working on the ground. The problem we have is that it's clearly not. And the problem is a lack of coordination and also a lack of staffing. You know, we do not pay our social care staff well enough. There are huge gaps. We are hearing this all the time. And actually the Tory changes to immigration changes that they want to bring in are not going to help this at all. So we need to entice people into the profession. But when they get into the profession, then it needs to be joined up and coordinated. And a minimum standards guarantee set by government is one way of looking at this. I also think that there has been too much market competition in this space. And what we need to do is to spread best practice, make sure that the best providers can grow. And very often, actually, it is local authorities that are delivering excellent care. But what we're seeing across the health and social care sectors, particularly after the introduction of the competition rules as part of the Health and Social Care Act, is that very often you end up with providers not being able to make ends meet, and the good ones go, and it's the ones who can write the best tenders who stay. That's the kind of system that's clearly not working for people on the ground. It's a very, very complex issue. There have been a lot of people who've looked at it, Dilnot and others. Actually, the last thing I'll say is we need to press the government to now get on with it. Simon Stevens said that, and he put his neck out and said that, and then got wrapped on the knuckles for doing it. But the time to wait has passed. We now need to act on this.
Thank you. You know, I think we can all agree this is a huge and very complicated issue, but it's great to hear both of your thoughts on that. Sticking with you now, Layla, for our final question about health and social care. You've mentioned already actually taking a public health approach to social care as well. Boris Johnson has just recently launched his own public health campaign, this anti-obesity campaign. So I wondered if you could share your thoughts on this campaign, and if you had to select one other public health campaign that you would like to champion next, what would it be?
Thank you. Well, this is an issue that I grappled with all through my teenage years into my early 20s. I ended up having a bariatric operation and I lost about half of my body weight. And more recently, I've been talking about it because one of the things that I want to highlight in the debate is that very often how it is portrayed is in a way that makes people who are obese feel like it's very much their fault, that genetic element to it isn't fully appreciated, and it can end up causing more harm than good, particularly in relation to their mental health. And actually that link between mental and physical health is very, very strong, and I'd argue is central to tackling any kind of obesity strategy. Is, you know, these aren't just people who have a weight problem, they are people, they are dealing with complex lives, and that negative spiral that can often happen where you are discriminated against, you're shouted at, you know, the microaggressions of, you know, you get on a bus and people just look disappointed that you might come and sit next to them, that all has its part to play. Believe me, I've been there and it's horrible. And we need, then this brings me on to the second part of the question, you know, what is it that we need to continue to champion? And I have to say, the Lib Dems have always been front and center of positive campaigns about mental health. And I think that is where we need to continue to push. It is so important. It's something that people are talking about more and more. And it's still underfunded, it's still underappreciated. So while slowly people are breaking down those barriers, actually I want us to continue down the route that the party's already been doing really well on, particularly under Norman Lamb, who really was fantastic on this. We are missing him and his input on this in Parliament, but actually there is space for us to continue to do it. And actually I know it was a thing that Munira Wilson wanted to push more, and then coronavirus came along and kiboshed it somewhat, but let's be the party of mental health.
And Ed, your thoughts on the current, you know, Boris Johnson's new campaign, if I can call it that, and public health more generally?
Well, first, I've had obviously different experience, Layla. I've always struggled with my weight and not really solved it, but today I am celebrating. I finished the program of Couch to 5K. I don't know if anyone's got that NHS app.
Well done, Ed.
It's a 9-week course and Laura guides you through it. And this week I've had 3 runs of 30 minutes. Not very fast runs, by the way, but I've done them. But seriously now, Boris Johnson's campaign. What's really interesting, I think we need to look at this, Johnson a few years, probably even a few months ago, would have been totally against what he's doing. He'd have talked about the nanny state, the government interfering and all that sort of stuff. And now he's changed. And maybe he's changed because he had that life moment in hospital and he's reflected on it and how he nearly died. And he's seen the impact that COVID is having on people who are obese. And that's fine. It's good that he's done that. And, I don't think we should be against it, because should we? I mean, there'll be issues of implementation and finance and all the rest of it. But the challenge is actually, Johnson, it took you having a near-death experience to realize the facts, the evidence, because the evidence was against his previous position. And as a party of science and reason and rationality and evidence-based policy, actually, we need to play this back to him on so many areas, because I think, it actually calls him out. He's shown his hypocritical ideological stance wasn't working before. He's had to face the facts. He should face the facts on many, many other issues. In terms of the other public health issues, if you look at public health issues that are out there that are killing people, and we need to do education awareness on it, and then some actions. Yes, there's obesity, there's alcohol and drugs, but actually the one that is the real killer is air pollution. So there's a lot of health issues that relate to the environment. I actually think mental health has got a big issue on the environment, actually. But air pollution is probably the most significant public health challenge we face today, where if we can sort out the public realm, we can stop a lot of deaths, respiratory problems, cardiac problems. There's even a lot of scientific evidence linking air pollution to dementia. So there's a whole set of things. I won't, give you the Liberal Democrat policy on air pollution, how we tackle it, but engineers and scientists are at the forefront of that, and it's not just in transport; it's in heating systems, it's in agriculture. It's a lot of areas that we have to get serious about if we're going to tackle air pollution. But I would actually pull that one out as the public health challenge that is still to be dealt with.
Thank you both very much. So now we're moving on to our final section of questions. We've obviously just talked about the Lib Dems as a sort of evidence-based party. So we want to talk about STEM in the party particularly. So, I'll start by reminding us all that obviously famously Michael Gove remarked in 2016 that the British public had had enough of experts. It looks perhaps that that's proving not quite to be the case during the coronavirus pandemic, though, we would add. The Lib Dems as a party are obviously filled with members and supporters with extensive expertise in science, in medicine, technology, and of course there are experts across the UK as a whole. So my first question to you, Ed, is how do you think that the party could better be harnessing the expertise within its ranks, and how could we be involving those members in party policy and decision making?
Well, actually, as acting leader, I've taken a big step to change this so we can reach out to more members. You may not have come across it yet, but it is being tested. It's called the Policy Lab. And what it is, I went to the Federal Policy Committee as COVID hit, and I said, look, this is going to be a massive impact on our society. We already knew then, and it's probably even now, we now know it's going to be even bigger. And we need to be ahead of the game thinking about the world post-COVID. And I said, look, let's do some work on this. Can you champion that as a part of the party? And they were very keen on that. And they came back with a proposal for a working party, which would meet and go away and report in a year's time. And I said, that's not what we want. And in fact, that's been, I've been around the party 30 years, party member 30 years, and I've seen too much policy that way, and it can deaden it. And I said, look, can we not develop a policy platform where members, wherever they live, can have policy debates? And it's a proper structured platform, because they exist outside the party. And they like that idea, and they've gone away and they've actually signed a contract, and they've got a piece of software, and they're calling it the Policy Lab. And I think there's about 2,500 people who already used it. So that's the way I think we could bring in more people, expertise, and wider members, because there's a lot of expertise we don't know about. who aren't even members of Aldes. There may be scientists and engineers who aren't yet members of Aldes. It could be a good recruiting mechanism for you potentially.
Perish the thought, yeah.
So, that's one thing I've already done, and I'd like that to develop further. The one thing I would say is that our party hasn't lost elections because of our policy. We've always had lots of policy, lots of good policy, and it does win people over, and it's important. But I think the challenge for our party isn't so much on that. Get that right. Yes, it's important. Update it. Absolutely. But I'm confident we'll do that. The bit that we've got wrong is communicating it well, and how you get from the policy paper to the focus leaflet, how you get from the policy debate at conference or on Policy Lab to the social media. And I think that's where we need to have a lot more thinking, whether it's on Policy Lab or in Aldes. And I think that is a bit where I'd love us to do a bit more work on. And then therefore stuff that is brought forward to us that could be more newsy. We'd have the credibility of it coming from people who are experts, and we could talk about that, but we'd also know that it can be packaged up and sold to the ordinary voter or the journalist. And final thing on this is slightly off beam. I'm not sure if this is what you're about, Emma, but I think we also should recognize that we're in power in parts of our country, and councils, although they may not be doing R&D budgets and so on, I think Liberal Democrat run councils could benefit from experts in the party helping them, giving them advice which isn't from the council officers. So that's just a random thought to leave with you. But I think Aldes could play a role supporting some of our councils.
Thank you. Yeah, all lots of interesting ideas. And Layla, will give you the platform now for some more.
So, I mean, yes, we are a party of reason. It's why I joined the party, possibly the geekiest way ever. I took what I was learning in my master's in comparative education, and I was looking at the research, and I researched it against what party policies were, and I did a grid and I matched which party was closest, and it was the Lib Dems, and that was actually what drew me to the party in the first place. So taking an evidence-based approach, one that isn't selective evidence, but one that actually understands the bigger issues, is why I was attracted to the party. And then when I saw how we made our policy, I realized that actually this is such an important way that we operate, and we need to deepen it. And I think bringing in more people into that process is really important. It's why I pulled together the Build Back Better book that I helped to pull together and edit before the leadership contest was launched. And in there are a lot of Aldes members and scientists who have fed in to that policy booklet. Because what we also want is not a smorgasbord of different ideas that are then going to get cobbled together. You also need the detailed work. We need to now get to the point where we are having those intellectual conversations with each other about what does liberalism look like in this century? How do we make sure that it's future-proofed so that we can think one step ahead? And what can we do more to encourage creativity and innovation in our own party? I think some of that has been lost. Paddy Ashdown used to say the party is its best when it's fizzing with ideas. This is exactly why Aldes is so important. And supporting Aldes, I've always tried to do whenever there's a conference event or whatever, I've always beeline for Aldes, just because I feel like we are very much of a similar mind. But how do we encourage more people to do it? Well, I think it's also about making sure that their ideas don't go somewhere and then fall off a cliff edge. And actually the technology that we're communicating with right now, Zoom, I actually do think there's a really important part that has to play with inclusivity in the party, because there's too many people, particularly if they've got busy jobs or kids or lives that don't allow them to come down to conference to be part of that conversation. They're all too often frozen out. So actually restructuring the party so that we can have that free-flowing ideas is one of the things that I want to achieve as leader.
Fantastic. Well, both of you, thank you very much. We've now reached the end of the questions for tonight, which brings us to your closing remarks. So Ed, you kicked off this evening, so we'll start now with Layla, and we'll ask you to keep them again to about 2 or 3 minutes. Over to you, Layla.
Well, first of all, Emma, superbly chaired, kept us very elegantly to time. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, all of you, for attending tonight. I've really enjoyed it, as I always do when there are events with Aldez. And the reason why is because we are a party that is rooted in logic, that is rooted in that rational argument. But we also have to accept that if we are going to get that message across, if we're going to deliver this new forward-thinking progressive vision for Britain, and there is a space for our party to do this, there is a distinct space that we can carve out between Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, then these policies need to be radical, they need to be evidence-led, they need to be making sure that they speak to people's hearts though and not their minds. And that's the bit that I think we need to focus on now, because we have to accept that where we are now is not good enough. You know, we are at whatever 6-7%. We can't have steady as she goes. We have to now be bold as a party. We have to bring decision making closer to people. We have to devolve away. We have to tackle racial discrimination in our workplaces. We have to introduce big, bold policies like a universal basic income. But all of these great policies that are going to speak to people on doors and convert them towards the liberal cause have to be done in a way that makes it really relevant to them. And so if the party creates the prose, then the job of the party leader is to turn that prose into poetry. That communication is where we need to start with the voters, to encourage them to look at how our country could be different, that change is possible, and to rebuild trust with them again. So that is why I'm asking you to vote for me as leader, because we need to start to credibly win back that trust and show people that there is a distinct liberal approach, a bottom-up approach, an approach that is evidence-led, an approach that puts people at its core. That is what liberalism means, and we are the ones who are going to be able to change the country for the better. Thank you so much for this evening.
Thank you, Layla. And finally to Ed.
Emma, thank you very much for chairing. Thanks all of you for coming on. And can I particularly thank the sign language interpreters for the job that they do. Friends, we live in such challenging times. And the question is, who's the leader to help us navigate through those challenging times? I think I bring vision, you know, my greener economy, fairer society, more caring country. But I bring experience, 30 years in the party, 20 years in parliament, 5 years in government, a lifetime of experience. And I think that is what we need at the moment. The economy is going to dominate our politics over the next few years. I'm an economist by training, a degree in economics. I put myself through night school for my postgrad. And I think we need to link that to the agendas that we talked about tonight, whether it's the fallout from COVID and Brexit, whether it's the climate change, the green economy agenda. And I think I'm well placed to do that, both from my training and having created hundreds of thousands of green jobs in government. But I also think the challenges for the party need someone with my experience. You know, when I first joined the party, we were 4% in the opinion polls. And Paddy Ashdown, who was, I think, one of the greatest leaders of the party, his first nationwide election in 1989, 11 months into his leadership, we scored just 5.9% in the polls. We've had these tough times before, you know, when there've been issues where we just haven't got a hearing. But I've seen how leaders in the past, particularly Paddy, managed to get us out of that mess. And I bring that experience and knowledge of how he did that, how others have done that, to the task ahead of us, because it won't be easy. The General Election Review says how difficult it is. There are many challenges, and the General Election Review, by the way, says very clearly, there's no quick fix. You've got to build those secure foundations, and we'll have to do it in council seats, in council areas, in constituencies across the country. And we'll have to choose the ones we're particularly going to go, the targeting strategy. And we've got to do that with a degree of wisdom and experience. And we've got to work out how we relate to the Labour Party. I fought 7 general elections and won 6. I am determined to use every ounce of strength and experience and of the vision to lead our party to win again, to beat the Tories, to get rid of Boris Johnson, to have a rational policy for our country. And I'll do that with emotion, whether it's talking about caring and my experience in my life, or whether it's talking about my passion for sorting out climate change. So I hope you'll back me. I hope you'll back the vision. I hope you back the experience. And I hope you'll know if you back me, you've got someone who's up for the challenge.
Thank you, Ed. And with that, I'd like to thank both of you again for what has been a very interesting evening. And I hope everyone at home agrees with that. Now I'm going to hand back to ALDE's chair, Josh, to formally wrap up tonight's event. But thank you once again for taking part.